beginning. So we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 20 through 24, but we're going to start in verse 17 to give us a little bit more context. Are you ready? All right, here we go. Verse 17. Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at any time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. For neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. Verse 20, each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. If you were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who was called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, he who was free when called is a bondservant of Christ. You are bought with a price. Do not become bondservants of men. So, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, there let him remain with God. So Paul is still currently dealing with some of the questions that the church sent his way, and there's a few big themes here. One of the big themes they were asking is this: how should my salvation affect my relationships with others? Now that I'm saved, how does that affect my relationship with other people? And so they ask questions about whether it's better to be single or to be married. They ask questions of, if I am married, do I need to have sexual relations with my spouse? Or what if I married someone who's an unbeliever? Should I stay with them or should I leave them? These were these relational questions. A second theme of their questions in chapter 7 is, how should their salvation affect their social status? Now that they're saved, now that we're saved, shouldn't our social standing and life situation be different? And at the heart of that question is a question that we all ask, and it's this: can I do better in life? Am I where I'm supposed to be? Am I living out the purpose that God has called me for, or can I do better? Am I in the wrong place? And the way that that question manifests itself in the letter is in two issues: circumcision and bondservant or slavery. Circumcision was one of the biggest divisive issues of the day. It separated those who were in the in crowd and those who were the outcasts. Same with the idea of slavery. It separated people that were of high social status and people who were of low social status. Circumcision was this religious barrier of the day, because the Jewish community would not accept you unless you were circumcised. So now imagine you're worshiping in this church, and within this church there's Jewish Christians, and they treat you differently only because you're not circumcised, and you feel like you're not equal with them. So wouldn't it cross your mind that maybe the answer to that problem is simply get circumcised? That'll fix everything. The idea of bondservants or slavery was one of the biggest social divisions of the day. The social barrier of the day was being a slave. And the term is quite broad, but typically what a slave is, it's a person who is viewed as the property of a Roman citizen. They have no rights. They have no freedom. And it's estimated that actually about a third of the people were slaves or bondservants. And what was interesting is it was common back then for slaves to be working side by side with freedmen. So now imagine you're the slave, and you're working the same job as someone who's free. Maybe you're sweeping the streets. Maybe you're working the docks. Or actually, there were doctors who were slaves. Or maybe you're a business manager. Don't you think that social distinctions would naturally arise in that situation? Don't you think that maybe you as a slave would be treated a little bit differently by your coworker who is free? And wouldn't it cross our minds that maybe the solution to our problem in this honor and shame culture is just to earn our freedom? Wouldn't that fix everything if I just earned my freedom? And yet what Paul says to these concerns is he has this theme of telling us to remain as we are. Let's look at our section in verse 20. Each one should remain, say remain, in the condition in which he was called. Were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who was called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, he who was free when called is a bondservant of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become bondservants of men. So, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, there let him remain with God. So what Paul is saying is, remain as you were called. If God called you while you were uncircumcised, stay uncircumcised. If God called you while you were a slave, stay a slave. And these are very shocking statements, right? Because for one thing, a Jewish person hearing a Jewish scholar like Paul saying that circumcision doesn't matter, that's scandalous. Because to them, circumcision was a big deal and a big part of their identity. And it's also kind of shocking because Paul says, if you're a slave, stay a slave. And just to be clear, he's not condoning slavery, because if you read the book of Philemon, he's clearly telling Philemon, who's a slave owner, to view his bondservant as a brother in Christ, and later on in the letter implies that maybe you should give him his freedom. So he's not condoning slavery, but it still seems weird that Paul is telling slaves to stay slaves. What about being proactive in your life, right? What about striving for the best? What about reaching for your goals? Where is that in all this? But if you actually look at the context of what Paul is talking about, if you look at the questions he's addressing of, am I where I'm supposed to be? If you look at the question of, can I do better in life by getting circumcised or by earning our freedom, what Paul is really saying to the church is this, that in certain situations, we should resist the temptation to change our temporary social or financial or professional destiny through our own strength. That we, in certain situations, need to resist the temptation to change our situation through our own strength. Don't act in the flesh to fix your problem. Don't get circumcised just because it might improve your social standing with the Jewish community. Don't earn your freedom because it might improve your social standing in general. Right? And this goes against everything the world preaches, because the world values ambition. The world values accumulating all that you can. The world values seizing every opportunity. But Paul says, remain. Don't go after the simple fix in your life. And I don't know what it is for us. I don't know what circumcision represents, and I don't know what slavery represents. But for all of us, there's a situation that we see that easy fix to the problem, isn't there? Maybe for some of us, there's this dream job. And you feel, if I could just find that dream job, then everything would be fine. Some of us feel like maybe there's this character flaw in me, and this character flaw keeps bringing up problems. And if I could just will myself to fix this character flaw within me, then everything will be fixed. Maybe for some of us, there's this person that just makes your life really, really difficult. And you just wish that maybe if this person would just leave me alone or get deported or, I don't know, get fired, right? If this person would just disappear, then that'll fix the problem. Or maybe there's this relationship that'll fix my loneliness. That'll fix the emptiness in me. And it's really easy to get fixated on some of these things as the simple solution to a lot of our problems. And Paul is saying, whoa, why don't we take a step back for a moment, and even though we're in a situation that might not be ideal, even though we're in a situation that we might hate or feel like we can do better, let's not rush in trying to change our situation through our own wisdom. Let's take a step back and ask God for his wisdom about what's really happening, right? Can I do better? Should I be somewhere else in life? And the source of that question, when we ask that, is often coming from this sense of inequality or injustice, that we feel that maybe we deserve better. Or maybe the source of that question is just really the shame of where you currently are in life. I went to a college full of brilliant engineers, and I became a teacher. And for a long time, I just considered myself as a failed engineer. Because I'm watching all my friends with their new cars and their new houses, and I'm a teacher, working with teenagers, barely scraping by. And that question comes up like, can't I do better? And there is a little bit of shame associated with that for a while. Because my sense of purpose and my sense of identity was really tied into not God's opinion of me, but my own opinion or other people's opinion. And the invitation to remain is maybe an invitation for us to trust God's view of us and seek how God sees us and not however the social standing defines us. Because you know what? In God's kingdom, social standing doesn't matter. In verse 22, here's what Paul says. For he who was called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, he who was free when called is a bondservant of Christ. So Paul's saying in God's kingdom, the distinction about slavery doesn't matter. Because if you're a slave in the world, in God's eyes, you're free. And if you're free in the world, you're still a slave to Christ. So those sort of labels, the things that divide society into the haves and have-nots, in God's kingdom doesn't matter. In God's eyes, he doesn't separate us as rich versus poor, college educated versus not, engineer versus teacher, single versus married. None of that matters in God's eyes. And so in verse 23, Paul says, you were bought with a price, so don't become bondservants of men. You were bought with a price, so don't become a slave again to men. He's saying, don't be enslaved by the system that tells you you need to be this way, that defines who you are by your success rate or your career or your income level. Don't fall victim into chasing these empty things that man has dictated you should chase after because you were bought with a price and because it really matters how God defines us. And when I read the Bible, here's how God defines me. Here's how God defines you. In Galatians, he says, you're all sons of God. Right? Can we go to the next slide, Gwen? You're all sons of God. In John, God calls me a friend if I obey his commandments, right? But God calls me a friend. In Ephesians, God says, you are his workmanship. And the word for workmanship is the word for poem. You and I are this carefully crafted poem, this masterpiece that God created. He never refers to me by what I do. He never refers to me by my social standing. He never refers to me by my accomplishment. He refers to me as a child, as a friend, and as a masterpiece, as a poem in his eyes. Remain. Can I do better in life? Of course. But we need to understand first how God sees us. So this idea of remaining is very prominent in the passage, but there's another idea that recurs, and it's this word called. So if we go to the next slide. 1 Corinthians 7:17 says, only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. Verse 20, each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Verse 22, for he who is called in the Lord is a bondservant, as a bondservant is a freedman of the Lord. Let's leave that up here. So that word called is the Greek word kaleo. And that Greek word kaleo can be translated as a divine invitation by God. So what Paul is saying is there was a time in our life where the Holy Spirit came down and invited us to enter into relationship with God and to trust him for our salvation. That's the word called. But here's what's interesting. Verse 20, that word condition, status, current job, whatever you want to place in there. Let's leave that up there, Glenn. That word condition actually comes from the same root word as called. And this is the only time in the Bible where it is used in this way. And this is what this implies, because it's a little different. what it's saying is that when we have a condition, it's not saying we have a divine invitation to trust God. It's saying we have a divine positioning from God in whatever job we have, whether we like it or not. We have a divine positioning from God in whatever status or social situation we are in, whether we like it or not. And so here's all I want us to consider. That wherever we are in life, maybe we ought to be open to the fact that where we are is not an accident. That where we are is not because of our accomplishments or our failures. That we're not just a victim of circumstances. That where we are is not because of our great qualifications or lack of qualifications. That where we are is a divine calling, condition, vocation, where God has positioned us specifically where he wants us to be. Just a thought. Proverbs 16:9, the heart of the man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. Right? We might make the plans, but you know what? God's going to put us where we need to be. So here's the bigger question. The bigger question in our hearts should not be, am I where I'm supposed to be? The bigger question should not be, can I do better? The bigger question that we should really ask is, what is my purpose in my current situation, even if I hate it? Even if everything in me wants to leave my current situation, the question we need to ask is, what is my purpose in it? Because purpose is key. I'm going to read an excerpt from a book written by Tim Keller called Making Sense of God. It's a good book. It's very practical. And he talks about Viktor Frankl, who is an author who survived the Holocaust and the death camps. Here's what it says. Viktor Frankl was a famous Austrian neurologist and psychiatrist, as well as a Holocaust survivor. In his book, Man's Search for Meanings, Viktor Frankl explored the reason why some people under those horrendous conditions seemed to stay strong and kind, while others simply gave up or even became collaborators in order to survive. His conclusion was that it had to do with a person's meaning in life, purpose. Many people had made career or social status or family their meaning. These meanings were based on things in this life that the death camp swept away from them completely. So some collapsed psychologically and spiritually and often died by simply giving up. Frankl discovered that the only way for prisoners' humanity to survive was to relocate their main meaning of their lives to some transcendent reference point, something beyond this life and even this world. And in each case, the meaning of life cannot be destroyed by adversity. If, for example, your meaning of life is to know, please, emulate, and be with God, then suffering can actually enhance your meaning in life. Purpose. Some of us feel like we're trapped in a job. Some of us feel like we're slaves to this corporation or slaves to our parents' expectations, our own expectations, our friends' expectations. And the question we naturally ask in that situation is, when will God open the right door? Because this is too hard. This can't possibly be from God. This situation is too difficult. God, when are you going to open the right door? Because I'm clearly in the wrong one. And that's the question we ask. But maybe the question we should ask instead is, God, what is your will for me in this difficult situation? What do you want me to learn about you in the middle of this slavery I'm stuck in? What do you want me to do to glorify you in the situation that I'm stuck in, that I just hate? And instead of living in despair, that we would understand that instead God has strategically dispersed us into where we may be for his glory and to expand his kingdom. Let's look at verse 21 again. Were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. You know what's really shocking to me is not that Paul is telling people that if you're a slave, just stay a slave. It's that second statement. Don't be concerned. Don't worry about it. Are you living in oppression and lacking freedom and in fear of death and punishment? Are you in a place in life where you have absolutely no rights? And Paul's saying, don't worry about it. It's all good. Right? Are you in a job where you're underpaid and your boss swears at you all the time? You know, are you in this really extremely difficult situation? Paul says, don't be concerned. What the heck? But the key is actually in verse 24. Here's what he says. So, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, there let him remain with what? God. This verse about remaining is different than all the other verses about remaining. Because Paul is saying, don't remain in a situation, remain with a person. Because ultimately, it doesn't really matter what you're doing as much as it matters who you're doing it with. It's not so much the activities in life as much as the relationship with God that we have that really matters. And we need to understand that what's more important than what we're doing is who we're doing it for and who we're doing it with. I'm going to show you a clip from a lady named Joni Eareckson Tada. And at the age of 17, she got paralyzed and has been stuck in a wheelchair her whole life. She got paralyzed, I believe, in the 1960s. So I just want to hear us to hear a little bit of her story. So can we play the video?
Yes. Back then, they didn't know what to do with people like me, young people like me. Thankfully, my sister invited me to live on the Maryland farm with her. But those were days when I would just tell her, Jay, I don't want to get out of bed. Just draw the drapes, turn out the light, turn on the air conditioner, shut the door, leave me alone. I can't live like this. I cannot live like this. But, you know, in that darkness, and I did that for 3, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, in that darkness, there was something in me, something about the human condition that just can't live with that kind of despair. We can't, so there's something about us that's just too significant. As human beings, we can't live with despair. We have to, I think hope is the most important thing to anybody, to find hope. And I remember I prayed a prayer. It was short, but I feel, looking back now, it was life-changing. I said, God, if I can't die, please show me how to live, because I cannot do quadriplegia. So you're going to have to show me how to live. And the next morning, April, when my sister Jay came into the bedroom, I found the courage to tell her to open the drapes, turn on the light, get me up in a wheelchair, and get me out of that bedroom. And it was a big, big, big step.
At what point, I just have to ask you, at what point did your faith become a big deal? Because it seems like, you know, you're cranking along here. You've got God in your life to some extent, but you know now, so many people think of you as a giant of the faith. I mean, you've been very public about your faith. Did that happen in your 20s? Was it after that? When did it happen that you basically said, I'm going to be publicly a Christian?
I never intended that. I was a mouth artist, exhibited my works.
What does that mean for people who don't know what that means?
Well, yes. I did more than draw lips. I put pens between my teeth, and since my hands don't work...
Pens or paintbrushes?
Paintbrushes.
So you were an artist.
Right, and I exhibited my artwork in Baltimore, and a NBC affiliate did a short story. The Today Show saw that, and then I was interviewed by Barbara Walters.
This was in the 70s?
In the 70s, and then some publisher saw the story, would you please write a book? Then Mr. Graham read it, then he invites me on a crusade.
Mr. Graham being Billy Graham.
Billy Graham.
Yeah, Billy Graham. And then they made a movie of that book, and then before you know it, I started getting all kinds of letters. And I was only in my early 20s. But I thought, God, I want to be a good steward of this influence, and so help me. It was one of those daily prayers. I can't do this, so help me be a good steward. And that's when I started this ministry, Johnny and Friends, and now we'll be distributing our 100,000th wheelchair in Africa.
Excuse me, 100,000th?
Yeah.
Wheelchair.
We work with prisons, 14 prisons in the United States, where inmates manufacture pediatric wheelchairs for us, and we take them overseas, and Christian physical therapists fit disabled children. Oh, it's so wonderful. Oh, wow. April, I am so blessed to be doing what I'm doing. I so love it. I mean, I don't love my quadriplegia, but I sure do love
Oh my God.
where it takes me and the people that I'm able to encourage. Such a joy. I am having a blast.
Okay. So when we watch videos like this, I don't know about you, but I always like, what am I doing with my life, right? There's this lady who's delivered 100,000 wheelchairs to Africa. But that's actually not what I want us to focus on. I want us to focus on what she said she does daily, and that's cry out to God. And I cut this part of the interview out, but actually that prayer she prayed the first time of, God, if I can't die, show me how to live. She actually prays that daily. God, show me how to live. I don't want to do this. I don't want to be in this situation. She can't escape her situation. She's stuck. She's paralyzed for life. But what she can do, or what she has been doing, is in the midst of that difficult situation, she remains with God. And she trusts God for her strength and for her wisdom. And I'm going to kind of conflict the message here, and here's why. So the message that Paul has given is, if you're in a difficult situation, maybe you should just remain there, because maybe God has a purpose for you. But I think the idea of remaining with God actually applies to those who are in a great situation and those that are in a bad situation, because here, it takes a lot of wisdom and a lot of strength to be able to stay in a place where you're suffering. And you can only do that if you remain with God. But at the same time, I would argue this: it takes a lot of wisdom and a lot of strength to leave a situation where you're comfortable, but that's not where God would have you. Same thing we talked about in the meet and greet, right? That there was maybe this dream job, maybe this great situation, but you know God's not there. And unless we remain with him, unless his wisdom influences us to obey, we're not going to be able to leave a situation, just as much as we're going to have a hard time remaining in a difficult situation. And that's the call to all of us, right? Remain connected with God. Morning service is not so much like this, but evening service, for whatever reason, the collection of people here, you're sort of at a place in life where you have a lot of flexibility. Morning people, we're like old families who can't really, we have no flexibility, like. No. Right? I mean, a lot of you guys are just, straight out of college or young college or just newly married or just want to travel the world. Who knows, right? You have a lot of flexibility. But at some point, that question is going to come up. God, what should I do with my life? And, my answer to you, because that was me at one point, is do what you want. But remain in God. Because I have to believe that as you remain in God, his Spirit in you and the relationship with him will guide your choices, will infiltrate your decision-making, will open the right doors. So there's always this angst. God, what's your purpose for me? What job should I take? Just take a job, goodness. But do it with him. Because as long as you do that, you'll be in the right place. Because you're with him. Can we close our eyes?